We're joined today by State Representative Natalie Mihalek. You're sponsoring legislation aimed at food safety. What brought your attention to potentially dangerous additives to food?
So we've introduced two bills just recently, and it's really for accountability and awareness. My own awareness came from, just different health struggles, getting older, wanting to be just more health conscious with what I was feeding myself and my young children. And it really was an eye-opening experience that I'm still going through currently. It's only been the last couple of years that I started to turn over the packages that I was buying and actually read the ingredients to try to figure out what I was actually consuming.
Your legislation focuses specifically on food dyes such as red 3, yellows number 5 and 6. What are the risks of consuming these products?
So red dye 3, I think, is the easiest example to talk about. This was banned in 1990 by the FDA for use in cosmetics and skincare products. They said they would issue a ruling later on its use in food. So it's been a number of years now, and we're still consuming it. So it's been shown in study after study, and I don't mean one or two studies, but I'm talking about hundreds of studies for this specific additive, that it's linked to cancer. These others are linked to hyperactivity in children, liver disease, all sorts of bad things that are happening to our bodies that are completely preventable. We're spending upwards of $4.4 trillion in this country every year in healthcare, and 85% of that cost is for preventable disease. We have to look what's in our food.
What role or benefits do these additives have to food?
So some of it's just for the coloring purposes, like you can make something brighter and more attractive to children, easier to market. Some of the chemicals in the other bill, the one that's not the food dyes, that 2117, some of that is for shelf life. Some of it is to separate chemicals in certain beverages so that it looks nicer in the packaging. All are completely unnecessary and have no nutritional value. There are alternatives, and most other countries have already explored those alternatives and have banned many of these ingredients.
Do you have any sense of why manufacturers don't utilize some of these other alternatives?
We're not doing anything to make them. It seems that there is an unwillingness to just do it on your own. Unless and until there are rules in place that actually prevent the use of these additives, there's no incentive for the food manufacturers to alter their recipes. So House Bill 2116 and 2117, they're very small changes. It's a handful of ingredients. And we know from experience with the European Union market and markets in Asia that these same companies have been able to tweak their recipes so they can put the food on the shelves in those other countries. So what we're asking for is a very small change, but part of a much larger conversation about what we're actually consuming.
You had mentioned a moment ago that roughly about 30 years ago, these products, these additives were banned from cosmetics and sort of other products. Why did it never get banned from food?
So the FDA is more focused on what can kill you tomorrow instead of what can kill you in 20 years. There's not a lot of resources available to them. This isn't a priority for Congress. They're not putting the money and resources behind the food part of the FDA, because they also regulate the drugs in this country. But there's just really not the resources available to them to actually do a pre-market review, a post-market review. And this had preceded, the 1990s. The rule that was put into place in 1958 from Congress was the generally recognized as safe rule. And that's where a lot of these additives have been able to exploit that role that was put into place for things like vinegar and oil and sugar and things that have been around for generations and we know are generally recognized as safe. These chemicals are not safe to consume, and they've only been reviewed, if at all, by the food companies and the chemical companies themselves.
How commonly are these additives used? Can you give us some examples of where you might find them?
You can find them everywhere. I could go back out into the green room, and anything that's available there is going to have these additives in it. So this isn't really, we heard a lot years back about Mayor Bloomberg banning trans fats. If you want to have a snack and you want to have, treat yourself to something sweet or savory, whatever it is, something delicious that you totally deserve, it can be, have fat, it can have sugar. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the actual toxins that are contained in this, and it's completely unavoidable. I try to avoid it myself. I spend way too much time in the grocery store going up and down the aisles on several different apps to figure out, what I'm eating and what I'm feeding my children, and it's the impossible task.
Are manufacturers required to disclose if they utilize additives like red dye number 3?
So A lot of the labeling is actually misleading. So you're supposed to put on the back of the label what's in your food. But if you take a look at any ultra-processed food, and that's almost 70% of the American diet, unfortunately, and even higher in young children. If you turn any of one of those labels over and you start to read it and you start to think, I don't know what any of this is, I can't pronounce it, I'm Googling it, I still don't know what it is. We shouldn't have to have a degree in science or chemistry to figure out what we're consuming.
Are there specific consumers that are more likely to be affected by a byproduct like red dye number 3?
Sure. Young children are the perfect example of that. They're more susceptible to a lot of the issues that come with those artificial dyes, specifically behavioral disorders. There's also the risk of fatty liver disease. We've seen an uptick in that in young children. Different demographics, like the Latino population in America, 48% have fatty liver disease or the beginnings of fatty liver disease, which we know is caused by all of these added sugars that we're consuming way beyond the recommended amount. And that was used to replace fats and other things back in the 80s when we thought, oh, fat's bad, all fat's bad. But there are demographics, and certainly this affects our children more than it affects an adult who has a larger body mass and is able to metabolize it differently.
Your colleague, Representative Melissa Schusterman, is sponsoring a companion bill aimed at, I hope I pronounced this correctly, potassium bromate and related additives in food products. Can you tell us a little bit more about her bill?
Sure. So mine dealt with the dyes and hers deals with some of the chemicals. So we've seen study after study with these chemicals that are linked to cancer, again, linked to liver disease, reproductive issues, the rise in obesity. And we know that obesity, I think that it's roughly 80% of our obese population has type 2 diabetes. So all of these preventable diseases, and that's really what we're taking aim at with both of these bills.
Pennsylvania is home to numerous snack manufacturers. Have you gotten any response or received any pushback from them?
Absolutely. Right off the bat, we received opposition, which was expected. We're asking food manufacturers to change their recipes. Their content is that it really should be done by the FDA. Well, the FDA hasn't acted. We know, red dye 3, like I said a few minutes ago, 1990. We're still waiting for some sort of movement on red dye 3. We can't wait any longer. If the federal government isn't going to act, then it's really up to the states to step in and protect Pennsylvanians and protect our food supply from these toxic ingredients.
Just Born Candy, based in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, had recently announced that they would no longer use red dye 3 moving forward. They're the manufacturers of Peeps. Have other companies followed suit? Mm-hmm.
So Peeps, I think, is doing a great job. They've been part of the conversation for years, and that's really the only one that I've heard of on a larger scale that is willing to take those steps to actually reduce the risk to the people that are consuming it.
Has the FDA taken a perspective, a national position on this issue?
No, I mean, the FDA has been relatively inactive on these things. Again, they are looking at, E. coli, when you have a contaminated lettuce or something at a restaurant, and they trace it back, and that they're putting the word out for that because that can kill you tomorrow. These things that are in our food supply that we're consuming day in and day out that are shown over time, and even not even in mass quantities, but just in a normal daily amount, can be shown to cause all of these horrible diseases, and they just haven't been concerned with that at all.
As you talked about reading labels a moment ago, are there specific things that PCN viewers should look at when they're purchasing their groceries to avoid these additives?
So I'd say if you can't pronounce it, I would question it, certainly. So I know for my own personal experience in the grocery store, when I turn something around and I see red and I see yellow and I see blue and whatever else is in there. And it's certainly very difficult, if not impossible, to avoid around holidays like Easter and Christmas and Valentine's Day. And certainly, for us in this role, we're going to parades and handing out candy and that sort of thing. It's very difficult to avoid in that space. But really in any snack or ultra-processed food, it's become a very difficult task to avoid these ingredients. But I'd say if you can't pronounce it, you probably don't want to eat it.
This bill is a campaign promise for you. Why has this issue been a priority?
It comes from, just personal experience through my own, health and just getting a little bit older and just trying to be more aware of what I'm feeding my children and the impact that it can really have on their behavior, their ability to learn in school. Ultra-processed foods have been shown in numerous studies to actually have a long-term effect on the memories of our children. So if they're introduced to an ultra-processed diet at an early age, even as they age, that can have effects on their memory.
Do similar bans exist in other states?
So there are 7 other states that have similar legislation. One state has actually been successful in getting it signed into law, and that dealt with red dye 3 and a handful of other additives that are in our food. But I think there is this awareness among different state legislators that they want to get involved. We see that our federal government isn't going to do it, so we're going to step in.
How are your colleagues in the House responding?
So I've been really pleased with the bipartisan support I've received so far. I think I have about 20 co-sponsors on each bill, and it's pretty split down the middle. We've got half Republican and half Democrat, because it's not affecting one party or the other. We all have to eat. We're all consuming this stuff. And I think once you're made aware of it, you become concerned about it.
Where's your bill in the legislative process?
So it's in committee right now. It's before the Consumer Protection and Utilities Technology Committee. I think that's what it's called now. But it's there, and we're looking forward to discussions with the chairman to see if we can actually get the bill up for a vote.
I'd like to shift our focus now to another bill that you're co-sponsoring, this one focused on food allergies. How did this issue come to your attention?
Sure. Again, personal experience, and I'm lucky that none of my children have these allergies. But when they were old enough to have friends and do play dates, and I had a couple of other mom friends that had children with severe food allergies, and they would actually, call and educate the other moms coming to the play date or wherever we were going, like, please don't bring anything with peanuts, or even if it touched peanuts, like my son could have an allergic reaction. Things can go really bad really fast. So just became a personal awareness from having that experience as a mom, and knowing other moms that were in that world, and I can't imagine how difficult it is to navigate, all of these different contaminants and allergies that are out there.
How prevalent are food allergies?
So the food allergies in this country have increased overwhelmingly over the last few decades. I know when I was a kid growing up in the 80s, I don't know that I knew of a single person with a food allergy. Now we've gotten better at identifying it, sure, but there is an increase outside of that ability to identify it, that it's just off the charts right now.
Now, the legislation we're talking about is primarily sponsored by Representative Arvind Venkat. Can you talk a little bit about what this bill would do? So this bill is basically designed to have restaurants include the information in a poster and also educate the staff. So right now in law, only and I think it's a federal law that does this, only the manager of the restaurant, who most of the patrons wouldn't have any contact with, only the manager has been educated on the prevalence of food allergies and the danger to serving somebody with allergies, the thing that they're allergic to. So this would basically educate the servers into asking their patrons directly, do you have any allergies that I should be aware of? And to know the menu, know what's in it, know what's been cross-contaminated with what, so that everybody can have a safe experience when they're dining out. Do you have any sense of how frequently there's a connection between a food allergy fatality and a restaurant?
So that bill was actually born out of an incident that occurred in Pittsburgh, at a Pittsburgh restaurant. It's a 28-year-old man. His parents had come and talked to both Representative Venkat and myself just about their experience with their son, who from a very young age had these food allergies, and they really educated him. They were so careful with everything, and then as he's growing, and now he's in his late 20s, he's on his own, and they thought they did everything right. And he went out to eat, and through a mistake at the restaurant, he unfortunately had 2 EpiPen injections shortly thereafter and died a short time later.
What obligations do restaurants currently have in terms of awareness of allergens that could potentially be in the menu? So it's not really been codified into law until now, and having this bill passed out of the House and awaiting action in the Senate, hopefully that is going to give the restaurants the tools that they need. And I understand, all of our businesses now in this post-COVID world are struggling for different reasons, for staff and inflation and higher cost of just everything. But this is really important. This could save lives. Is this legislation based off perhaps of other legislation that exists in other states?
I believe there are other states that have very similar laws on the books.
And where is this bill in the legislative process?
This bill is awaiting action in the Senate right now.
I'd like to shift our focus once again now. One of the big things that the legislature is responsible every year is passing a state budget. As a member of the House Appropriations Committee, what are your general thoughts on the proposal that Josh Shapiro had announced back in February?
So I think he characterized it himself as ambitious, and I would agree with him on that. There was increased spending across the board in almost every agency. So being on the Appropriations Committee, we had the opportunity just last month to sit with each of those state agencies and ask them and really get into the nitty-gritty of the budget. What is all this extra money for? What's it going to do? What we found was these new line items, and sometimes it would be $1 million here or $13 million there. These new line items were things that were already being done. So our questions were, how can we take the money that's already being spent and spend it more wisely to actually accomplish this goal? Because I think at the end of the day, we agree on a lot of the policy items. It's just how do we get there and how do we pay for it, where the bulk of the disagreements came
I'd kind of like to zero in on some of the specific asks within the budget proposal. The governor's proposing utilizing a portion of the rainy day fund to satisfy some of the proposals within the budget. Is that something that the Republican caucus will support?
I don't think so. I mean, since I've been here, and I've been in office about 5 years now, when I came in, I don't remember what the exact balance was, but it was next to nothing in the rainy day fund. So we spent the last several sessions and several budget negotiations actually putting that money away in the rainy day fund. These spending proposals that we have before us would actually empty that out within the next 4 years.
Last year's budget, one of the reasons perhaps for the delay was a debate over whether or not a proposal similar to school vouchers would be included. Do you see that resurfacing at all this year?
It's probably going to resurface. I don't know in what way, shape, or form it will, but it has been a priority for our caucus for several years. We were excited initially when the governor mentioned that he was also in support of it. This is really an opportunity for kids in really poor performing districts to have a shot.
This was something that, as you'd mentioned, the governor had initially proposed, and then after he had conferred with the House Democratic caucus, he changed course on that issue. What does the governor need to do to regain the trust of your caucus?
I think first and foremost, having some form of communication with us. We are still part of the legislature, even though we are the minority party. It needs to function with all 203 members. So I think that, just some communication, opening up those lines could go a long way into rebuilding that relationship.
The governor's also proposed, once again, increasing the state's minimum wage. Do you see that happening?
I'm not sure. This has been proposed since I've been here. Maybe it comes up for a vote. I don't know, what it would look like even on the majority side if all the House Democrats can support something like that. I know that it wouldn't go very far in our caucus, but I would, again, expect it to probably rear its head in some way, shape, or form.
The governor talked about legalizing recreational marijuana. There have been some legislative proposals in recent years. Is there an appetite to pass that?
I think there's an appetite amongst certain members to pass that. I think we have a lot of work to do before we're actually in a position to pass it. And if it is something that's going to pass, we want to make sure we're doing it right. We want to make sure we're protecting Pennsylvanians. We want to make sure we're updating other laws that would have something to do with it, like the DUI laws, for instance. So I think we have a long way to go before we're actually going to see something that is, ready to be passed and ready for Pennsylvania.
Governor Shapiro has also proposed utilizing roughly, I believe, $1.5 billion toward mass transit funding over the next 5 years. Is that going to be a tough sell, particularly for members that are not hailing from more populous regions? Mm-hmm.
We heard this over and over again during budget hearings. Members were, coming up and asking the question, what can I go back home and tell my constituents we're getting? Because this is a lot of money, this is a big chunk of the budget, and we're getting zilch. So I think it's going to be very difficult to sell.
How useful are what happens in the budget hearings? How much does that information translate into what you see actually coming into the final budget?
It's actually very helpful to sit on appropriations and take part in those hearings because you do have a greater understanding of where our money's going. Because at the end of the day, I think first and foremost, we're stewards of taxpayer dollars. So where are the dollars going? Without those budget hearings, it would be really hard to know where all those dollars are going. And even with the hearings, it's hard to keep track of, $40+ billion.
What are your top proposals in this budget, or I'm sorry, your top priorities in this budget?
So I would like to see our school districts taken care of. I would love to see the students being taken care of by being able to utilize that scholarship program that had failed in the last year's budget. We do have a number of priorities within the DHS budget. We know many of our direct care workers are not being paid what they're worth, and it's really affecting the care that's being received. I know I've heard from constituents that somebody's not shown up to work, somebody's quit while they're during their shift, and it's really a direct result of the pay for those workers. So we've seen a lot of conversation surrounding that.
Where do you see areas for compromise?
I mean, the budget is the product of a negotiation from 4 caucuses, right? So I think there's room for compromise in almost any of those areas. Certainly there's, each caucus has its own set of priorities. But at the end of the day, I mean, this is really about governing. Like the 4 caucuses really have to make an effort to come together, figure out where those compromises can be had, and move this forward for Pennsylvania by June 30th.
As you mentioned, June 30th is the magic deadline. Is there an impetus to hit that deadline, or what are you hearing from other lawmakers about whether or not the budget gets done on time?
So I've heard the same rumblings that I heard last year. And last year, of course, we didn't pass the budget until, I think, December 13th, 18th, something like that. Pretty far past the June 30th deadline. I've heard similar rumblings this year that June 30th isn't a hard stop. Like, we're going to just go until we get the product that we like.
Representative Natalie Mihalek, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.